So I'm going to talk a little bit about epistemic actions. First of all, why talk about epistemic actions? Surely everything that's important in science that bears studying is just the propositions that we've written down, that scientists write down, the questions, the theories. We don't really need any more than that. Isn't that right? Oh no, that's not right. Okay, well, that might derail things a little bit, but says who? Okay. So most philosophers of science are in agreement that that we do need to talk about scientific practice. So fair enough. So yeah, it's true that the growing consensus has started around the practice turn, as it's called, in the mid-1970s. This idea that we need a practice-based approach to philosophy of science. And Pasek Chain has talked about this disconnect that exists between the proposition-based frameworks that philosophers often use to analyze scientific theories and the scientific practice as it's actually conducted in the real world. It doesn't always line up. And so Scientonomy doesn't currently accommodate such an activities-based perspective. So that's the mission here, to try to introduce a practice-based perspective into Scientonomy. So we'll start with defining epistemic action. And then we'll look at different types of epistemic actions. And then we'll talk about the mechanism of local action availability. How do epistemic actions actually become available to epistemic agents? And finally, we'll very, very briefly look at a case study so we can see an example of how this happens. And we'll use the great chemist Antoine Lavoisier for that. So let's start with talking about the necessity of a definition for epistemic action. So do we actually need one? Can we characterize epistemic actions by means of other notions in Scientonomy? Well, the answer is no, because epistemic action would be a basic notion. You can't define it through more specific notions like theory acceptance, question acceptance, and for instance, taking a stance. We would consider that an epistemic action. You're taking the action of taking a stance. So it wouldn't be coherent logically to use any specific epistemic stance in the definition. So what should our definition be? So the starting point here was to compile a list of specific action verbs that we use in discussions around scientific practice. So I looked through the following sources: the Encyclopedia of Scientonomy, the diagrammatic notation we talked about yesterday, and 2 papers by Pasek Chain. And so we want to look through all of these, this obviously non-exhaustive list of action verbs and figure out how can we make sense of them. What's relevant to us and what can we sort of discard, all in an effort to find some criteria for our definition. So here is just a sample of the list. There are many more you can find in the paper, and even the full list itself, of course, is non-exhaustive for relevant action verbs. But this is the starting point. So some of the usual suspects are there, at least. So we find that we can actually categorize these in 4 ways, in 4 categories. So we have relations between epistemic elements, relations of epistemic elements with the world, actions of agents involving epistemic elements, and the 4th category, actions of one agent towards another agent. We'll start by looking at the first 2 categories here. So between epistemic elements and relations elements with the world. So we see answering, implying, right? So theory X implies theory Y. These are both epistemic elements. The epistemic agent isn't involved here, right? Necessarily. And the same thing on the right side in category 2. Definition X or theory X describes phenomenon P, right? So this is phenomenon P in the world. But when we think of scientific practice and epistemic action, we're thinking about agents doing these, agents involved in activities. And so we see that these verbs, we do use verbs in conjunction with epistemic elements without actually denoting any agent's actions. So for that reason, we don't really need to consider these in our definition here. They're important, but we don't need to consider them for the definition. So let's look at the other 2 categories. So we have actions of agents involving epistemic elements, right? Describing, measuring, observing, etc. And actions of one agent towards another agent. So causing another agent's actions, delegating authority. So we see on the left, obviously these are actions that epistemic agents take. They seem extremely relevant. On the right, well, these are actions of one agent toward another agent. Where's the epistemic element? Well, it's just implicitly in there. So we can boil down all of these ones on the right to actual agents, actions of agents involving epistemic elements. So it's fully expressible in terms of actions of category 3. Like for instance, delegating authority would be just one action, sort of accepting the theory, one agent accepting the theory that another agent is an expert in such a topic, and also employing the norm that they should accept a theory if that other agent deems it acceptable, and similarly for the others. So we can get back to actually defining it. The main challenge here is how broad versus narrow to make it. On the one hand, you want it to be exclusive enough so that it's useful, and that warrants addition to the ontology. But perhaps more importantly, it should be broad enough to account for all potentially epistemically relevant actions globally. So throughout history and around the world, even actions we might not have even thought about yet. So start with a broad definition. At base, what do they all have in common? Those category 3 actions. Well, formed by agents, that much is a given, and they involve epistemic elements. At base, they're formed by agents. They involve epistemic elements. So if we were looking for the most inclusive, broad definition that would be still reasonable, we would use these 2 criteria: an action of an epistemic agent that involves an epistemic element. So this would probably be the most likely definition that we come up with that would account for every possible epistemic practice we deem epistemically relevant. And if any narrowing of it would risk excluding epistemically relevant practices that we just maybe didn't consider or haven't even thought of yet. Another positive is that it aligns very well with sister categories in the scientonomic ontology. So, for instance, epistemic stance, we generally understand that to mean the attitude of an epistemic agent towards an epistemic element. So some nice symmetry there. But it's not without a possible objection that it could be overly inclusive. So yeah, maybe it's worth considering the merits of something a little more exclusive. So now let's think about trying to come up with a narrower definition of epistemic action. So if we start by taking a closer look at those relevant epistemic action verb lists, we can try to find some traits that distinguish them from non-epistemic actions. So for instance, formulating, proposing, etc. These actions seem to have as their goal the generation of new epistemic elements. Other of the actions here seem to be like testing, analyzing, seems to involve the evaluation or the assessment of epistemic elements. And some, of course, involve both. So it seems like all these actions involve generation of epistemic elements and or assessment of epistemic elements. So if we use these criteria, we could provide a bit more of a specific definition as an action of an epistemic agent taken with the intent to generate or assess an epistemic element. So for this definition, we would need the intent to accompany the execution of the action, right? The intent to generate, the intent to, or the intent to assess. But this one is also not without its objections. Some epistemically relevant actions, right, like publishing, spreading knowledge, I'm sure you can come up with many more. It would be kind of hard to establish the intent of, right? It doesn't necessarily easily conform to one of those 2 categories. And so beyond this, we could, easily see this potentially excluding other epistemically relevant actions, right? An engineer uses many epistemic elements to do their work. Doesn't necessarily involve the intent to generate or assess epistemic elements. would we be so comfortable, just necessarily prematurely excluding this? So this leaves us with these two potential options. So let's compare them. So we saw a broad definition that's most likely to account for all epistemic practices. It aligns with the other definitions. This is another one. There's a general affinity, for inclusiveness within the relevant scientific practice literature for the notion of, what to consider important for study in as far as epistemic actions go. So and as well, there's a lack of consensus. So this plays to wanting to play it a little safe anyway. But of course, it could be potentially too broad and include lots of trivial, epistemically irrelevant actions. The narrow definition, specific, that's nice. It will take out trivial actions. But we could cast too wide a net with this and perhaps disqualify other relevant actions, as we've said. And the fact that an epistemic action must necessarily involve this intent, right? That's to generate or assess an epistemic element. It seems a little bit of a serious, right, non-obvious ontological claim. We couldn't just flippantly say this. It would probably deserve its own much more in-depth study, and we're looking for a starting point here to bring Scientonomy into step with the consensus on scientific practice. So that's that's pretty serious negative. This negative for the broad definition, not necessarily too fatal, because the fact that an action counts as epistemic doesn't mean it must be studied, only that it may be studied. So for all these reasons, I think that the broad definition is probably the way to go. So this is what I would propose: epistemic action, an action of an epistemic agent that involves an epistemic element. Of course, these aren't the only two options that we consider in the world, but they're sort of stand-ins for sort of a broader family of them, which we can talk about if anyone's interested. We see that there are different kinds of epistemic actions. So looking at some of them, we see some could be global, right? And some are local. So by global, we mean that an epistemic action is available to all agents transhistorically and universally. By local, an epistemic action that is not available transhistorically, right? So only arises in some time period or to some agents. So, example, taking a stance, you can't really have scientific progress without that. And simulating, especially computer simulating, right? I'm sure, Aristotle did not even think about doing that. So that leads us to the question, what happens to a mosaic when a local action becomes available? So I would equate the availability of local epistemic action A, for our purposes, to an agent amounts to the employment of the norm that epistemic action A is permissible, obligatory, desirable, etc. So how does this actually work in practice? What actually happens for a local action to become available to an epistemic agent? Well, what's the process like? Well, let's start with a very simplistic example on telescopic observation. So this is borrowing from Max Merkin, his 2018 paper. Talks about how technology becomes available for scientific use by an agent. So we see that a new method allowing for the acceptance of telescopic data results from an accepted theory of the effectiveness of telescopic observations. We have this theory, the effectiveness of the theory leads to the method, right? So this is highlighting the employment of the respective method of theory acceptance, right? But so let's sort of shift viewpoints and instead focus on the respective local action, right? So we can see that there is an underlying mechanism here that brings about this local action. There are three elements to it, right? So there's two normative and one descriptive. We have the descriptive here we already saw, but then we need this normative to say it's permissible, desirable to obtain data about distant objects, and then together they lead to the availability of the action. So yeah, right. So this employed norm is exactly, as we just discussed, the scientonomic expression of the availability of that local action. So before you know it, you see how a local action can become available. So an action becomes available to an epistemic agent when the norm of that action, A, is permissible, desirable, is deducible from some subset of other employed norms and accepted theories of that agent, right? So let's see how the local epistemic action of computer simulation can become available to an agent. So we have the same thing. We have the one descriptive theory, that accepted descriptive theory, the employed norm, it is desirable, and we get the second norm, which equates to the availability of the action. Of course, a very, very simplistic example here. So I believe that these examples, simple as they are, reveal a general pattern, right? That an agent must employ at least one norm and accept one theory from which the norm action A is permissible deductively follows for that action to become available to the agent. So we can formulate a theorem, and it'll deductively follow from the law of norm employment in conjunction with this statement that we just talked about, identifying the local action with the employment of the norm, that it is permissible. So we see third law norm employment, local action availability we just talked about. And so we get that a local epistemic action becomes available to an agent only when its permissibility, desirability is derivable from a non-empty subset of other elements of the agent's mosaic, right? Okay, so if we take a look at a bit more of a nuanced example, we can see how this works in practice. So we can't get into all of the nitty-gritty of this one because of the time, but we'll see an overview. So in this case, the local action is one introduced by Lavoisier in the late 18th century. And essentially, this is how it worked. In its most sort of basic experiment version, he would weigh, he'd have air and metal in a sealed vessel. He'd take the weight measurement. A combustion or calcination reaction would take place. After the reaction, he would weigh the contents of the vessel again, and the change in weight would be taken as indicative of the composition changes. So, for example, if say the metal gained a bit of weight, obviously the air lost some, then he would take that as indicative as a portion of the air has become fixed in the metal, changing its composition. So this is how I would put it into for the diagrammatic notation, but not as important. So of course, what is the availability of this epistemic action of determining composition by weighing? It is the employment of this norm, right? It is desirable to determine the composition of substances by weighing them before and after a chemical reaction that takes place in a sealed vessel, right? Or it requires this norm, rather. So according to the theorem, for it to become available, we'd have to be able to derive this from other employed norms and accepted theories. So without getting into all the details of this case, the historical background reveals that there are a few important required accepted theories that were required for Lavoisier to accept. So I won't go into all of them, but this is just an overview. So basically, he needed these three accepted theories, and he also required, obviously, the existence of the technical means to weigh these substances, and the employment of this norm that it's desirable to determine the composition of substances. This norm would have been sort of a consequence of his embrace of the compositionist viewpoint, which also would have given him the other accepted theory at the top here, number one. But this is just to show you that we can build, and obviously you don't need to follow this, but we can build a theory relation diagram using each of these historical facts, right? These accepted theories. But what's really important here is to see that despite all this complexity and everything that that's going on here, at the end of the day, if we look just at the bottom bit here, it follows the same pattern. So right at the end of the day, we get the accepted descriptive theory, right, and the employed norms. So right, it's desirable to determine the composition of substances, together with the fact that it's possible, gives us the employed norm, the availability of the local action, right? So it's desirable to determine the composition of substances by weighing them before and after a chemical reaction that takes place in a sealed vessel, right? And this is exactly what we have at the bottom here. So this is the same pattern we looked at before, right? The accepted descriptive theories and the employed norms. It sort of boils down to the same thing in the end, despite the added complexity. All right, so just a quick summary. We looked at a definition of epistemic action. We saw why it's potentially beneficial to go with our broad definition, our inclusive one. We looked at global versus local epistemic actions. Then we looked at how what it means for a local action to become available. And finally, we showed and deduced the local action availability there. Yeah, thank you.
All right, guys, so we have still a good time for questions. Oh,
Yeah, so it seems like we sort of need two different kinds of actions. An epistemic action we might think most directly as being an action directed at an epistemic element, like the formulation of a theory, the asking of a question, or the taking of a stance toward an epistemic element, something like that. The other kind of action we need is that people take goal-directed practical actions in the world to generate new knowledge, the doing of an experiment, the seeking of funding to do an experiment, things like that. I think that your goal is sort of to bring that second kind of action indirectly by saying it's the employment of a norm. But don't we need two fundamentally different kinds of action? One is an action directed at epistemic elements, okay, the formulation of a theory and so forth. And then there are these practical actions that have the goal of generating knowledge, like the use of an epistemic tool to do an experiment. Okay, so don't we need two different kinds, maybe one in the epistemic domain and one in the socio-technical domain, a species of practical action that's doing something in the world, doing something in relation to an object of inquiry or something like that?
That's a good point. Very interesting observation. My reasoning was that I think there are a lot of different ways actually that we could break down the different kinds of epistemic actions, even beyond just direct and indirect. Mm-hmm. And so it's more about which ways to do it. That's certainly one a good idea. I think at the end of the day, it's about, I guess, what's going to be most conducive, right, for working with, the history of science, for coming up with, new insights, right, and analyzing these episodes. If it is found, later on that a little bit more, granularity there, would actually help, analyze these historical episodes, that absolutely, by all means, I think it would be worth further categorizing epistemic actions. But sorry, my view was it's too soon to know, and that there's the possibility that just this one building block could be could perhaps suffice at least at the start, or be an elegant way to sort of build upwards from, because sort of related to that, Ha-Sek Chang, he says that there should be, or he argues for a hierarchy, basically, of epistemic actions. The exact terminology escapes me at the moment, but he has different sort of systems of activities and all that sort of thing. So I was thinking also along the lines, should we have that in Scientonomy? Should epistemic action just be one thing in a hierarchy, and this would obviously be probably the lowest rung, right? But yeah, I felt that the purpose of this paper, for right now, was just to bring Scientonomy into accordance, and then those questions could be dealt with and answered in more detail alongside trial periods by trying this with historical episodes, seeing what happens. But it's a very good point. Yeah.
Josh, could you show? Do you have like a more fine-grained picture of that big diagram? Is there a way to sort of zoom in? I wanted to see specifically how we arrive at the left side of things.
So at the top left, this idea that the total quantity of matter of the products of a chemical reaction that takes place in a sealed vessel is equal to the total quantity of matter of the original substance divided by the reaction. And this follows from conservation of matter, which of course Lavoisier did accept. He also accepted that weight was a measure of the quantity of matter, not an obvious theory by any means, but he did accept it. So this follows from this that we can basically replace quantity of matter with total weight, right? And then it follows from this that if the weight of one of the substances decreases, then the total weight of all the others must increase by the same amount, right? If the total amount is going to stay the same. And so then it follows that if it were possible to weigh these substances before and after, right, it would be possible to determine which substances have lost weight and which substances have gained weight, right? So even if we just measure, say, the metal, if we assume there's just metal and air, right? We just measure the metal, we know it gains weight. We also know that the air has lost that same amount of weight. Again, just using these two, substances as the most simplistic example because it's easier to work with. Anyway, so on the other side, we have determining which substances have lost weight and which have gained weight after the chemical reaction takes place in sealed vessel makes it possible to determine the relative weights of the constituents of a substance. And so this might seem obvious to us, but it's not. It's this is kind of a compositionist idea, right? So compositionism, I just sort of touched on it. Basically, the idea that substances are made up of made up of different substances, slightly more fundamental substances in varying proportions, right? So that's basically what this is saying. So we're finding the relative weights here. So we say if it were possible to weigh the substances before and after a chemical reaction takes place in sealed vessel, it would be possible to determine the relative weights of the constituents, right? Does that make sense? And then did you want to go over the rest of it too?
I guess for the sake of time, maybe just a couple of words about how this possibility was ascertained. I understand how we get to the conditional that says if it was the case, and so that somewhere there should be something that says it is the case, right?
Right. Oh, sorry, of course. Okay, so on the one hand, he did have Lavoisier did have these great balances. He was known for very precise balances he had. So and he previous experiments like this were very inconclusive in general because the weights couldn't be figured out with much precision. But for him, he definitely had this. So we have this proposition: it's possible to weigh substances before and after chemical reaction, and therefore it's possible to determine that, right, the relative weights, the constituents of the substances by weighing them, right? On the other side, this is based on his compositionist understanding the relative weights of the constituents of a substance as indicative of the composition of that substance, right? So again, kind of a novel idea of the time. And putting this together, it's possible to determine the relative weights of the constituents of a substance, or sorry, it's possible to determine the constituents of a substance by weighing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Pleasure.